Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong and I am a physicist, psychology researcher, and biblical scholar, and I'm excited to announce that I have released a theory of everything. A theory of everything. So if you're into science and theories of everything and philosophy and even theology, I think you'll really enjoy what I have in this video, and I think you'll really enjoy the paper that I have on my website, link in description. So this week I released a paper called One Concept to Rule Them All, and it's about how entropy can be used to explain virtually everything in the universe. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to walk you through at a very high level what's in the paper, and then if you like what I have to share, you can check out the paper, which is available for free on my website. So just as a little bit of background, I went to school for physics, and then in 2016 I got pulled into managing a psychology research project at McMaster University. And as I did that project and as I was doing a whole bunch of research, I fell down a number of rabbit holes, which led me to something called the free energy principle, which was something developed in neuroscience by a professor named Carl Friston. And so I spent several years pondering the implications of the free energy principle, and I realized that what Carl Friston had done had applications in psychology, it had applications in sociology, it had applications in ethics and aesthetics. And so after a number of years of writing and making videos on various topics, I pulled together everything that I had learned into a single paper. And that paper, as I mentioned, is called One Concept to Rule Them All. So anyway, in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you, again, like a really high-level breakdown of kind of what's in the paper and how we can use entropy to explain virtually everything that humans have discovered. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out with entropy as it's found in physics. So entropy, as I'm sure you're aware, is a scientific concept that measures the amount of disorder, randomness, or uncertainty within a system, and it's also a measure of energy unavailable for doing useful work. So, the diagram that I have here, on the left-hand side, you have something that's high entropy, it's very random, very disordered, and then on the right-hand side, you have something that's low entropy, which is ordered and arranged and so on. Okay, so that's entropy. So scientists first discovered entropy in the 1800s as they were working out the limits of combustion engines during the Industrial Revolution. But then in the mid-1900s, entropy came up again. And entropy popped up in information theory and signal theory. So scientists at Bell Labs were trying to figure out the limits of information transfer across digital mediums, and Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver in the 1940s released a mathematical theory of communication. And so they found that information worked mathematically the same way as entropy and information transfer. And they pointed out that the informational value of a communicated message depends on the level of disorder in that message, or the level of surprise. If something likely occurs, the message doesn't contain very much information. But if the message is disordered and surprising, the message is much more informative. And so in a mathematical theory of communication, they showed that information transfer is mathematically equivalent to entropy and follows a number of the same mathematical principles and formulas and so on. So entropy doesn't just show up in energy transfer and combustion engines, it also shows up in information transfer. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, a scientist named Carl Friston started applying these principles to neuroscience. So Carl Friston basically pointed out that the brain is primarily an information processing organ. The brain is responsible for processing information. And he showed, with a whole bunch of very complicated mathematics, that the brain acts to minimize surprise. The brain wants to minimize disorder. Okay, so when it gets information from its senses, it compares the sense information to what it has in its mental models, and any difference is calculated as surprise. And so the brain wants to minimize that mathematical quantity. It wants to not be surprised by its sense information. And so there's a whole bunch of complicated mathematics around this. It took me a couple of years to think through, but conceptually, what we have is the brain wants to be in connection with reality, and it does that by updating its mental models in order to accommodate new sense information. However, there is another way that you can minimize surprise, and that is by controlling your environment. Controlling your environment. You can either change your brain to reflect the sense data that you're getting, or if the sense data that you're getting is surprising or whatever, you can change the environment so your sense data starts matching what's already in your brain. So Carl Friston showed that cognition and action are actually surprise reducing mechanisms. They're meant to reduce surprise. And again, there's a whole bunch of complicated mathematics around this, but conceptually that's kind of what's going on. And over the last few years, Carl Friston and some of his research colleagues also showed that social behavior, which they call federated influence, is a mechanism by which groups of brains, groups of people, minimize surprise individually and collectively. And they use communication to do that. So all social behavior and all social communication is a way for us to reduce surprise as a group. And that has to do with survival. You know, like if you are, say, in a tribe in the wilderness, in the jungle or something, and a jaguar comes out of the jungle, that's surprising, right? And so someone who sees the jaguar will alert everyone else so they're a little less surprised that the jaguar is there. And maybe as a group you'll go and take care of the jaguar or something, so you're not so surprised. Okay, because surprises from a survival perspective are usually or can be bad. So we don't like being surprised as individuals. We don't like being surprised as groups. And so social communication is a surprise reducing mechanism. Now, that's kind of a chronicle of how entropy has shown up in science. It started out in physics, then it moved to information science, and then neuroscientists have shown that entropy and surprise are major, if not primary, factors in all brain activity and even social activity. The brain wants to minimize surprise, it wants to minimize entropy, and so it thinks and improves its understanding of the world, or we change the environment so we're not so surprised by it. So anyway, that's a brief chronicle of how entropy is shown up. Now, what I've done in my paper is I've kind of taken those discoveries and I've shown that there are some pretty profound implications. There are some pretty profound implications. So, for example, let's take psychology. Psychology right now is kind of a collection of discoveries without an underlying paradigm. However, if we take the work that Carl Friston and his teams have done and we apply it to psychology, we see that the fundamental dichotomy in all human behavior is updating your mental model, changing what's in your brain, or changing your environment, controlling your environment. And so when we take that dichotomy and use entropy and surprise as a lens to view psychology, some pretty interesting things pop up. For example, cognitive dissonance. If someone experiences information that they don't want to think about, they'll deny, they'll attack, they'll shoot the messenger, right? They'll mischaracterize the information and so on. So cognitive dissonance is really an attempt to control the environment instead of update one's mental model. It's an attempt to control the environment. And at an extreme end of that spectrum, you get something like narcissism, which is a form of perpetual delusion where people, who have narcissistic personality disorder, they essentially live in a delusion and they go through great lengths to control their environment and control other people so that they aren't surprised by the information that they're getting. No, I'm not a bad manager. The employees are out to get me. I'm a good person. You're a bad person. Blah blah blah. Right? So from the perspective of Carl Friston's work and entropy and so on, we can start to explain things like cognitive dissonance and narcissism. And we can also tie them to the fundamental laws of physics that govern energy flow and information flow. Now, sociology works the same way. Sociology is, again, it's a collection of insights and discoveries. It doesn't really have an underlying paradigm. And we can use entropy to start to create that paradigm. Because if we look at all human social behavior as a surprise reducing mechanism, we can start to appreciate things like journalism, social activism, social media, mass media, marketing, okay? And we can see that what we're trying to do through things like social activism is reduce surprise for the group. It's like, hey, like some people encounter a problem in society and they bring that to everyone else. So we can try to reduce basically surprise and improve survival for the whole group. It's like, for example, it's like, hey, like we've got a homelessness problem, and maybe we should do something about that and help those people. Because if we don't, it's just going to create more problems for society. There's going to be more surprises down the road and so on. So like maybe we should take care of this social problem or that social problem. Okay, it's an attempt to reduce surprise for the group. Now, similarly, there are phenomena like censorship. Censorship, where the government or whatever tries to suppress certain points of view. And what is that? It's also a surprise reduction mechanism. But it's what we have with censorship is the dominant group in a society doesn't want to update its mental model, and so they forcibly suppress other members of society who are carrying and communicating uncomfortable information. So again, it's the dichotomy of improving your mental model or controlling your environment. And what we have with things like censorship is a form of environmental control. And at an extreme end of that spectrum, we have things like genocide, which is basically this group of people is so surprising. The fact that they exist and the fact that they're so different is surprising to us, and we're going to control our environment by eliminating that group of people so we don't have to deal with them or think about them anymore. So even something like genocide can be understood from the lens of entropy, surprise minimization, and the dichotomy between changing your mind and controlling your environment. Now, interestingly, I've got a video on this, on ethics, and we can even apply entropy to philosophy. So if you think about ethics, for example, a big thing in ancient Greece, and, for, like, it was mostly ancient Greece, was virtue ethics. The ancient Greeks were the ones who really came up with the idea of virtues and living virtuously and so on. And when you examine, those ancient writings, you find that what they're describing are personal qualities that are required to update your mental model. So consider that, let's say you've got a brain, you're going through the world and you're getting sense information. We have to think about what personal qualities do you need in order to be able to update your mental model to reflect reality. Things like honesty, being able to be honest about what you're encountering in the world. Things like intellectual courage, having the courage to think through things and update your mental model. And also curiosity, being curious about the world and open to some level of surprise, right? So those are called intellectual virtues. And it seems that what the ancient Greeks did is they figured out that having certain intellectual virtues was required in order to update your mental model effectively. And so Carl Friston's work and the work that's been done on entropy and information transfer and so on, it shows that those intellectual virtues that we've settled on are actually validated by science, neuroscience, and physics. So we're able to take one step towards defining ethics. Defining ethics. So again, I've got a whole video on that. It's actually one of my most unpopular videos based on the comments. It seems like people are kind of resistant to the idea that ethics could be backed by science, but it is what it is. And anyway, information transfer and the things that I've discussed also apply to aesthetics and art, which is very interesting because in our day and age, we think of art as being subjective. It's purely subjective. There's no real such thing as beauty. It's all a social construction, blah, blah, blah. And, I've got a video talking about this in depth. And I spoke about this at the Art Gallery of Hamilton. But art is social communication, which is a form of information transfer. Okay, and so when you think about artistic works as forms of information transfer or a kind of signal, we can start to evaluate aesthetic works from the perspective of signal theory and signal transfer. And so a good work of art or a beautiful work of art is a high quality signal. It's a good signal. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, okay, what qualities does a good signal possess? And it turns out that we start circling back to classical beauty standards in terms of things like legibility and depth and decodability, the ability for the audience to decode what the artist has encoded in their art. And so anyway, that's kind of a high level view of the paper, of some of the things in the paper. Basically, entropy, so to recap, entropy started out in physics, it popped up again in information science, it popped up again in neuroscience, and we're now able to take those discoveries and apply them to pretty much every field of human knowledge. We can apply these discoveries to psychology. We can apply these discoveries to sociology. We can apply these discoveries to ethics, to aesthetics, even to folklore and mythology, and even to biblical theology, which, I talk about on my channel and so on. And so it seems like what we have here is the beginnings of a theory of everything. We're able to use entropy and information transfer and energy transfer. We're able to use that as a lens with which to view every sphere of human knowledge. And I think that's quite astounding. I think that's very exciting. And I think that, in the years following, as more and more people become aware of this, we're going to be able to take a new, deeper perspective on all of the discoveries that we've made in different fields. Because right now, psychology is its own field, sociology is its own field, ethics is its own field, aesthetics is out in left field. Okay, and we're now able to take all of these different fields and these different disciplines and unite them under a common understanding. And by the way, a number of academics have envisioned this. This has been a talk among certain academics for decades in terms of we hope we're going to be able to do this one day. We hope we can unite everything one day, but we don't know how to unite the sciences and the arts and all of these things. We don't have the information yet. And now it seems like we do. And I'm really excited that I was able to write a paper about this. I'm really excited that YouTube exists, so I'm able to talk about it, because it seems like what we have here is a viable theory of everything, or at least enough of a theory of everything that we're able to start uniting all of the disciplines under a common framework and common lens. So anyway, If you liked what I talked about in this video, check out my paper. It's available for free on my website. And yeah, there's a lot more on my channel. Um, I talk about all of these topics in more in-depth ways in various videos across my channel. So spend some time on my back content, and I think you will be quite enthused about what we've been able to discover over the last few years. Thank you very much, and hope to see you back soon.